Our next scholar is Dr. Jennifer Najera. Come up to the podium, please. She received her doctorate in anthropology from the University of Texas, Austin in 2005. She's currently an assistant professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies at UC Riverside. Her project is titled The Borderlands of Race, Mexican Segregation in a South Texas Town. She's going to be interviewed by Assistant Director, Dr. Javier Iribarren.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, first of all, I want to thank everybody for this opportunity, and it is a privilege to be introducing our IAC postdoctoral visiting scholar, Jennifer Najera. I am going to give you a brief overview of what she's doing with us, and then we'll just go into the questions. Dr. Najera's focus at the CSRC is on a project using a historical ethnography about the culture of segregation in a South Texas community from 1915 through the end of the 1970s. It examines the various stages of segregation from its early establishment in the first part of the 20th century to its accommodated form in the 1940s to its gradual unraveling after the civil rights and Chicano movements. She relates these stages to how popular understandings of race and nation through those time periods affected the local experiences of Mexican origin people. In her work, in her book, she highlights how the ambiguous racial positionalities of Mexican people allowed some of them to be exceptions to Anglo rules of racial dominance throughout the period of segregation. While such exceptionality might have demonstrated that there was some permeability of those lines of segregation, actually, she concludes that, in her analysis, or rather her analysis reveals how the structure of segregation was maintained well beyond landmark national legal mandates of desegregation throughout these processes of selective and limited incorporation. Dr. Najera argues that this local examination of the history of Mexican segregation illuminates larger issues about race, nation, and belonging in the US-Mexico borderlands. So without much further ado, I'm just going to ask you a few questions. In your opinion, what is the interface between codified and de facto segregation, as you see in your research, and their effect on our community decades ago? Throughout the decades, or through the research in those decades that you are doing?
This was a big question for me when I was doing my research, the difference between de facto and de jure segregation, or the relationship, I guess, between de facto and de jure segregation for Mexican people. That might just take if I just project, can you still hear me? Okay. So this was a really big question in my research, was the difference.
Use the microphone.
Oh, I'm not
the other one.
Okay, so the difference between de jure and de facto segregation was really important. And frankly, when I was doing my graduate work, I didn't really want to get into segregation for Mexican people because it was so messy. Because no matter that, a lot of people would say, yes, we lived in separate communities, yes, they segregated us in the schools, yes, in the church, we had to sit on this side of the church. There were definitely racial lines that could not be crossed. There were always people who did cross those lines. There were always these exceptional Mexican people who could cross those racial boundaries. And frankly, in the community where I studied, I never found any laws. There were no residential covenants. There were no evidence. There was no evidence of signs that segregated Mexican people. And so I thought, how can I talk about Mexican segregation when there's all this messiness involved, right? As a graduate student, I just wasn't really willing to take that on as a project. But as a professor, I thought, well, let's just do it. And so I've just been really exploring that messiness, that space. What does it mean? That segregation existed beyond the law. for Mexican people, and what did it mean that there were Mexican people who were able to cross those racial boundaries, and were they really fully incorporated into Anglo society, or did they too experience limits? And so that's kind of the relationship, I guess, between de jure and de facto segregation that I saw in my research.
So, of course, what I'm going to ask, I think you probably have an idea of what I'm going to ask you now. So, seeing how discrimination is being aggressively codified today, like in, for example, Arizona, what is the interface nowadays between, legalized discrimination and, ingrained cultural racism in places like Arizona, California, and indeed, the whole country?
It's a big question. But I think as an anthropologist, I think what I'll go with is the idea that our cultural attitudes really do inform policy, and this is not just the case today, but really the case historically. People's attitudes about the general population's attitudes about people of color have informed policy, and so right now I think that what we're seeing in Arizona is the codification of a lot of racist attitudes about Mexican people, and in particular Mexican immigrants. The idea that that Mexican immigrants are unassimilable, and I think this is a big deal. I think that one of the reasons why there's so much backlash against Mexican immigration is because so many people hear Spanish when they go grocery shopping or when they go to the mall, and I think that it really bothers people, that people aren't speaking English. And so there's this notion that Mexican people aren't being assimilated, for one. And then for two, there is, I think, an increasing sort of conflation between undocumented immigrants and drug smugglers, right? And you see that, I don't know if any of you are familiar with this new show that's come out on National Geographic called Border Wars. But it's this idea that the people crossing the border need to be stopped because they're smuggling drugs, really ignoring the fact that a lot of the people crossing the border are quite innocent and themselves victims of drug smugglers, right? We saw the really horrible case south of Brownsville in a town called Matamoros where like 70 migrants were executed by drug smugglers for reasons we don't really know. But I think that these racial attitudes about Mexican origin people, and in particular right now immigrants, are what is really feeding the fire in terms of anti-immigrant legislation.
And I think that we are getting close to our allotted time. So this is kind of like a practical question. What lessons from the research that you're doing about the past can we take, not just to understand what is going on today in terms of the discrimination and the assault that our community is undergoing, but what lessons can we extract from the research that you are doing to also look at solutions, not just understanding, but also solutions?
One of the things that I found in my research was the complicated nature of Mexican segregation, that it wasn't necessarily legal. It wasn't consistently legal. And so when things like the Civil Rights Movement, Civil Rights Act, pieces of legislation were passed, that did not end Mexican segregation. In fact, the schools in this particular town where I was studying did not become desegregated until 1971, well beyond the 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education, right? And the church, was not desegregated until they built a new church in the 1980s. But there were all these instances of this prevalence, beyond the legislation, that the segregation persisted. And so what I saw was that in order for integration, racial integration to happen in the community, there had to be organization, grassroots community organization. It had to be the people, the community members themselves, who were basically operating as individuals, as small groups, as sort of, in larger movements to enact actual social change. And I think that we can see that today too. We have, I think, at times questionable representation, in terms of politics, that we feel like maybe our political representatives are not representing our needs. And so I'm really personally very heartened by the grassroots activism that I see, among students, among community members, because historically, I know that it's that kind of action that can really promote change, not just by what's signed, into law, but by really what happens in a community. So I think that that's something important that we learn through research like that.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, IAC.
Well, did someone have a burning question? I know. That's fine.
I have a question.
Okay, all right.
And thank you. This is very, very interesting what you're doing. And my name is Michael Rodriguez, and I'm from the Department of Family Medicine down in the south end of campus. And I just wanted to, in addition to congratulating you, I want to ask you, the issue of segregation is frequently associated, it has a negative association. In some of the health literature, there's been identification of some positive aspects of segregation, sometimes referred to as ethnic enclaves, where you actually have some protective, positive health impacts or effects of groups coming together through maybe numerous different mechanisms, be they social support, social networks, etc. Do you get into any of that with your work? Or can you comment on that phenomenon?
I don't get into that in my work, but I definitely have seen that, that the communities that were segregated, the Mexican community, where I studied that was segregated, it was really a tight-knit community. There was a lot of consistency in terms of culture. They all spoke Spanish, they all had sort of community celebrations. It was when integration happened that the cultural fabric of that community begins to unravel. And in fact, even during the period of segregation, there was a certain point, the Mexican school was K through 3, and then at 4th grade they started going to the Anglo schools. You'd think that ostensibly that would be better because the resources were definitely better at the Anglo school, but it was in that context where Mexican people really experienced a lot of trauma. It was leaving that community, that sort of safe haven where they experienced a lot of their first experiences with racism and trauma. So I don't get into it too much, not really in the book, but I definitely see the positive aspects of segregation. The problem, of course, is the resources that were available to Mexican communities during that time period, which obviously were substandard.
Oh, you had okay. One more question. Sorry, you can't get away.
Thanks for a very interesting, presentation. In the last few years, I don't know if you've had time to study, because of the terrible American economy, statistics are showing that there's a reverse migration. There's approximately 1.5 million or more that having returned to Mexico because of the finding work in America. That's and the second part of that question is the motivation for some immigration in the last 2 or 3 years because of the terrible drug wars going on in Mexico at the present time, people fleeing fear of their own safety, etc., etc., etc. There was a program on National Public Radio today about businessmen from Mexico being very fearful for their lives and their families, and many of them have set up their business operations, or at least their headquarters in Juarez, Texas, and are running their operations by remote cameras or something, still in Mexico. So I don't know if you've had time to study those two issues recently.
Not in depth, although I have, as an immigration scholar, I am, trying to keep my finger on the pulse of these issues. But no, it's true. In terms of the economic recession, that definitely has impacted the Mexican migration to the United States, and it's really something that I think, in terms of policy, is important to note that Mexican immigrants and Central American immigrants don't come to the United States if there is no work for them. And so you see, you know, the sort of out-migration happening because of the paucity now of labor opportunities for them. As far as the second part of your question is concerned, yes, it is a lot, especially among the elite classes of Mexican people. You see definitely more of a fear for their lives. There's a lot of kidnappings that are happening and setting up shop in the United States. Honestly, really also a parallel to the Mexican Revolution of the turn of the 20th century, where a lot of elites fled the country to be safe in the United States. And so you see some historical parallels there as well. But it is a difficult time, you know, and there are a lot of innocent people being affected, I think, by the drug war on both sides of the border.
The next speaker will be Dr.